Buonasera. Grazie mille.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm very pleased to see such a large audience in this room, which is not uncommon in this festival, to listen to one of the most interesting lectures of this festival. In the past few days and in the previous editions of the festival, there has been a lot of discussion on the role of the state in a country's economy, in the world economy. The financial crisis highlighted the need for a debate on the role of the state in the economy, not only in Italy, but also in other European countries, as well as in the United States. There have been a number of ways in which states have taken action during the crisis, and during the crisis of sovereign debt, states are again taking action. Some authors talk about a disastrous return of the state into the economy in Italy. There's a lot of discussion on protectionism and all that. So in this context, it's a great honor and a great pleasure for us today to have the opportunity to hear the opinion of a great and authoritative economist, Professor Philippe Aghion, who has joined us this year for the second time at this festival. Professor Aghion has been teaching, has been a professor at Harvard University for over 10 years. He had the PhD in Harvard as well, and his scientific activity is focusing particularly on the theory of economic growth. Professor Aghion, with the help of his colleague of Peter Hollage of Brown University, also developed what is known as the Schumpeter paradigm, which calls into question again the importance of technological innovation on economies. The result of this has been an important publication, a book called Endogenous Growth Theory, published in 1998, and more recently another book called The Economics of Growth, which has also been translated into French in the meantime. But Professor Aghion is not only a theoretician of growth. In fact, he is always involved in important reflections of economic policies, and very often he works as a consultant for policymakers. Professor Aghion was also involved in the famous Sapir report that had been provided to the then president of the European Commission, Romano Prodi, in 2003, which was another area of important discussion. He was also a member of the Attali Commission on growth freedom, or growth liberation, as we called it in Italy. And more recently, last year, Professor Aghion guided an international working group on autonomies of universities and university governance, which was also the basis for the Aghion report given to the French government, on which a new policy has been based to relaunch some centers of excellence in French universities. Last but not least, Professor Aghion recently ended preparing his latest book called Repenser l'État, Rethinking the State, that will soon be published in France. With the editor Le Seuil, and during the presidential elections in France, he is also going to have an important role in discussing this debate on the role of the state. which, as you know, is a very heated discussion in France. So it's a great pleasure indeed for us to have this opportunity to listen to Professor Guion and his feelings on the role of the state in the economy.
With me, so I'm sure I will disappoint you now. So let me just. I'm calling my presentation "Rethinking Growth and the State," but my book is called "Rethinking the State." Voilà, that's so. In fact, there is something strange. I mean, we had just a big financial crisis, okay, which shows the limits of the market. You might think, well, you know, given this crisis, now everybody should be convinced that you need the state, that, you know, you need state intervention. And now what's going on, if you look in the United Kingdom, you have a government who wants to minimize the size of the state. What just happened in the United States, you have the election of a Congress that wants the minimal state, okay? And so you might think that's kind of paradoxical, no? Is that, how come a crisis that should have told us, whoa, the state is there, without the state we are lost? Now you have various governments who say minimal state. So let's try to think a bit where this is coming from. So it is true that during the 30 years after World War II, we were, Italy, France, we were what you could call a catching up economy. We were catching up. Growth was mainly based on imitation, on factor accumulation. To do those things, you needed a certain kind of welfare state and a very interventionist state, you know, make sure that, you know, we are in the right things, and industrial policy, limited competition, the state was there, and it was okay. Then what happened is that after 30 years of that kind of growth, there was, we exhausted imitation a bit as an engine of growth, and globalization happened. And globalization forces us to innovate. Why? Because you have other countries like China, India, or the tigers in Southeast Asia who can imitate, they can imitate much cheaper than we can. So we need to do more than innovating. We need more than imitating. We need to innovate. But the problem is that innovation requires very different ingredients from imitation. An innovative economy, it's an economy where new products replace old products all the time. New firms replace old firms. New jobs replace old jobs. It's an economy with mobility, with flexibility. So that's what led some people to say, maybe the state is too cumbersome. You need to have the less state because you need more flexibility in the system. That was a bit the argument. The argument today for those who want minimal state is more than that. They say not only this, but you get out of the crisis with very difficult budgetary situation. Given the budgetary problems we have, even more you require minimal state. You see? That's the argument of the ultralibéraux. You say ultralibéraux in Italian? Ultralibéral, ultralibéré, yeah? Same thing as in French, yeah. That's their way of thinking, okay? So what I will argue here, I should have had a microphone, because you think, but if I do this, it's not good. I should sit down, no? That's right, the poor woman will be lost. Okay, no, so I stay there. No, don't worry about that, don't worry, it's perfect. I will, for once, I will try to move less than usual. I talk about the economics of mobility, so I try to illustrate it by being very mobile myself, and now I will be very rigid while advocating mobility. Anyway, but so what I will argue here is that what we need is not so much minimal state. We need state differently. We need to rethink the state. We don't need to reduce the state. We need the state to do other things than what the state was doing before. You see, that's the way how we have to rethink. So I will tell you about three important roles of the state. One role is the state as an investor. The state has to invest to favor the new ideas and the materialization of new ideas. Why do you need the state to do that and not just independent agents? For two reasons. One reason is that you have what we call credit constraints. Suppose you are an individual, you want to create a new firm. It's very hard to borrow at the bank. You see, you can borrow, but there are limits to how much you can borrow. The other idea is what I call knowledge externality. When you decide, oh, that's fantastic. When you decide to invest in education, you look at yourself. You don't look at the externalities you may generate on other people around you, on your children, on the knowledge that you improve. You see what I mean? So it's the combination of these externalities and the credit constraints that legitimate the role of the state. You see, that's why you need the state. That's why the neoliberals got wrong, because they forget about the credit constraint and they forget about the externalities. So now you need three roles. The state as what I call an investor in new ideas, eclosion, you see? So then there is the state as an insurer, because when you have an economy of innovation, as an investor, it's investment in universities, it's investment in health, because if you have unhealthy people, they cannot be innovative. It's investment to help small and medium-sized enterprises. It's investment in industrial policy, because we cannot let China alone do industrial policy and not do it ourselves, okay? That's investor. Then you have the state as an insurer. Why? Because in an innovative economy, you have new risks. One risk is the labor market risk. I told you that an innovative economy is when you have job creation and job destruction all the time. Well, you have to insure people. But insuring people is not transforming people in assisté. How you say assisté in Italian? It's not assistiti. It's to help them rebound into the system. It's to say, look, you have a safety net. We will give you salary. We'll give you support to retrain so that you can rebound into the system. So it's not subsidizing idleness, laziness. No, it's helping people rebound. You need the state for that, you see? They will not do that. So that's to insure against the labor market risk. You didn't have that problem before when we were imitating, because you would do all your life the same in the same firm. You see what I mean? Whereas now with the new world, you don't stay in the same job very long. You change jobs all the time. You need the state to help you in this process. That's one risk. Another risk is the macroeconomic risk. There are, recessions and expansion. Typically, when firms are hit by recession, they reduce their investment in research development and this kind of thing. You need to help them maintain those investments, because otherwise they cannot be innovative. So those are the new risks, and there is the environmental risk, very important. Global warming. Huh? You will hear Bowman later on. Will tell you about apocalypse, and I will tell you further that you should not, you should be less pessimistic than he is, but not too optimistic either. Okay, so that's the state as an insurer. Then there is the state as a guarantor of the social contract. You need the state to keep the society together. If you have, for example, if you have corruption or if you have special interests, then the society is divided. If you have a very poor or very rich, then you have exclusion by below or exclusion by the top. And also you need the state to invest in trust between employers and employees. It's not that the state can substitute to the relationship between employers and employees, but the state can help build trust between employers and employees. So in all that, that's what I call the state as a guarantor of the social contract. And those are the roles that the state needs to play in a modern economy, okay? I think I will be done when I finish, when I'm only at the third slide. So the move towards an innovation-based economy. So the idea that I was telling you is that during the post-war period, growth in European economies was driven by imitation. Over time, and particularly with globalization, innovation has become the driving force of growth. But innovation requires flexibility, turnover, and therefore you need different policies, different institutions to enable turnover. For example, when you have an innovative economy, universities become very important. If you are just imitating, secondary school, primary school, specialized schools are enough. But when you are innovative, you need good universities. In France and Italy, we have a problem there. You have good universities, but they are underfunded, okay? And could be much better governed. We need to deal with that. You need to have stock markets more active. We don't have them, okay? We need to have, a number of institutions that foster innovation, okay? So that's something which will be a recurrent theme. Okay, the state as an investor. So I told you it's the combination of credit constraints and knowledge externalities. Investment in education and health, people don't internalize the effect it has on the rest of the society and on future generations. The combination of the two makes it's important for the state to intervene. You see, for example, knowledge externality, it may look to you very abstract. It could be that your own return to education are not very high, but the return of your education in terms of growth of the society is huge. You see? It's much bigger than your own contribution, than your own wage. That's what we call the externality. Because you contribute to common knowledge, and to the knowledge of your children, and to the knowledge of your neighbor. And those are things that are not, that you don't cash in. You see what I mean? Those are externalities. Okay. So the ideas I want to push with you on the investors is that you could say, well, you know, you come and you say what we call tarte à la crème, is we say in France. You don't have the expression in Italian, tarte à la crème, you know, things which are obvious, cream tart. Maybe you don't have this expression, cream tart. But I will not, it's not just so obvious, because you see, quality, not just quantity of investment matters. When the state invests, the state should invest well. It should look at the results, at the governance. So it's important when you invest that you look at how you govern your investment and how the institutions that you invest in are governed. So for example, in France, I was active in the university reform. We are giving much more money, 10 billion euros we are giving to French universities to modernize. But we tell them, look, not for free, my friends. You have to change your governance. You need to accept outside boards. You need to reorganize yourself. You need to have autonomy. You need to, and it goes together. You won't get the money if you don't reform yourself. And I think the state now, whenever it reforms, should insist on changing governance, should itself give the example by having a good governance of its own funding policy. So that I think is a big idea that I want to push. Okay? I will illustrate that idea, the complementarity between investment and governance, looking at education and growth, health and growth, and industrial policy. So first, this is PISA and growth. Alors, on the horizontal axis, so I have countries here, and various countries do, so the horizontal axis is the PISA test. You know what the PISA is. Who doesn't know what PISA is? So no, I don't talk about the town PISA. Huh? It's PISA. Okay. Yes. PISA tests, those are tests to measure the quality of secondary school children, like age 12 or 13, no? And so they go through math and math texts and also literature, reading tests and things. And so you can benchmark how well people do. Or the great winner is Finland. Finland, they are fantastic, PISA. But then some people are more or less good in PISA, okay? So I don't see, you see, France is doing not very good. Italy, I don't know where it is here. Better, usually it's as bad as France. But, yeah, one day I made a bad joke, but I won't make it here. Say, you know, Italy is always the same as France, and then I compare, but I made a bad joke. I can only repeat to you privately because I can't do it public, that joke. Okay. And then on the vertical axis, I have growth. And you see that countries that have better PISA tests grow faster. So when you have pupils that are well-formed, you grow faster. You see, that's what I call the externality. It's not only that they will earn more money, they will generate more growth. That's very important. Portugal, for example, is a huge problem. You have many children are dropouts of secondary school in Portugal. It's a big problem in Portugal, you know, the fact they have poor schools, okay? So that's very important. But now if I look here, and I look at just the years of schooling and growth, you see that there, you don't see a relationship. If you are just saying, I will invest in more years in school, not looking at quality, not looking at the PISA test, there the growth is not increasing. You understand? That's why it's important not to have just more investment, but better quality of investment. Okay? That's the example of schools. But then you can look at health. We know that higher life expectancy gives you higher growth, you know. If you have a population that lives longer, it has higher growth. Why? Because usually they are healthier. So when you are healthier, you can learn better. You can adapt better to technological progress. You can be more innovative. If you are sick all the time, you are not very innovative. Also, when you live longer, you save more money. And therefore, that's good for growth as well, okay? But on the other hand, you know, there is health is costly. The health system, it costs money. But you see, for example, if you decentralize it a bit more, you can save money. You see, you have changes in governance you can make to make the health system more effective. So, for example, Sweden has the same life expectancy than France, but much, much cheaper. It's a much cheaper system. In particular, they decentralize more, and they did other things. I don't have time to tell you. That's why governance is so important, okay? Now I talk about universities. This, on the left hand, on the horizontal axis, is the expenditure per student. On the horizontal axis is what I call the performance index. Have you heard about the Shanghai ranking? The ranking of universities. It's a ranking done by the Chinese to rank universities around the world, okay? What you can see is that, you see France and Italy are always together. You can see them. We love each other. You see, but of course Sweden, US, they do much better. Those who spend more in higher education have better, there they have better performance. But what you can show is something in addition. Autonomy of universities is also good. Those who are more autonomous is that the university president has the choice of who he wants to hire and fire. They have more autonomy universities. They also do better. And in fact, what you can show is this diagram that shows that, in fact, that's the effect of increasing funding for a 6 years period that's done on US data. The dark blue is when you give money to autonomous university. The light blue is when you give money to non-autonomous. You see the effect is bigger when you have autonomous. So you have really a complementarity between how much money I give and the governance of universities. You see that? That's the point I want to make. Governance goes with funding, okay? I want finally to talk about industrial policy. Industrial policy is the idea that you help sectors. That you could think that it's very natural. And after the war, many countries would do that, industrial policy. But then there was the view that that goes against competition, because competition is that everybody is equal. Anybody can enter or not. And it's true that some type of industrial policy was going against competition. So for example, the European Commission is totally against competition. So if Mario Monti was in the room, he would kill me, I guess. But I respect infinitely Mario. But it's true that, you know, the way competition policy is implemented is saying anything that has to do with industrial policy is not good, you see? Because you pick winners and losers, because it's the state who decides, not the market. So you pervert the competition system. You should avoid it. But on the other hand, there are various reasons why you could rehabilitate industrial policy. The first one is green innovation. The problem is you want people to innovate green. The problem is that if the state does not intervene, they innovate dirty. Why? Not because they are dirty like her. No. It's because you tend to innovate usually where you are already good. But we are very good at dirty technologies. For example, fuel intensive. We are very good at those. Suppose you are a good dancer and a bad cook. Would you innovate in dancing or in cooking? In dancing, obviously. You will not innovate in the things you are terrible at. It's the same for firms. When firms that have done a lot of fuel-related technologies in the past, they keep doing those. So that's why you need the state to redirect technical progress, to say, I will tax you there, and I will subsidize you there. And if you don't do that, you will not have green innovation. And if you don't have green innovation, you will not get out. Carbon tax alone will not get you out of the climate change problem. Okay, that's one reason why you want industrial policy. It's because under laissez-faire, firms innovate, but they may not innovate in the right direction. Okay. The second reason is that industrial policy is not necessarily against competition. It can be made competition friendly. So for example, I've done a study that based on Chinese firms where we've shown the following, that sectoral or industrial policy has very positive effect if you give it to more competitive sectors, the subsidies. So you don't subsidize only one firm in the sector. You subsidize the whole sector, any firm. And you don't give to only one firm. You give to many firms in the sector. You see what I mean? So you pick a sector which is competitive, and you give to several firms there, not only to one. So you preserve competition. And what you can show is that instead of being one against the other, industrial policy can be a complement to competition policy. You see, there is a way to marry them. They are not enemies. They can be married. I can be the priest, you know. I can marry them. I marry you. Okay? So, so that's, I think, a new idea. And again, it's the idea of governance. It all depends. The debate is not should we have or not have industrial policy. In fact, most governments have industrial policy. It's how you should govern industrial policy to make it competition and innovation friendly. That's the new revolution, you see? And that's another illustration of my governance and subsidy thing. That concludes my first part on investor. How long do I have? 20? 20 minutes? Okay. So summary, state as an investor, you need fiscal consolidation. Alors that's one important thing, what I want to say on investment. Mr. Cameron Mr. Cameron or the Republicans in the US, they say you should minimize spending to solve the budgetary problem. I tell them, be careful. If you are sacrificing investment in health, education, support to small and medium-sized firms, you are shooting yourself in the feet because you are reducing your growth potential. And reducing your growth potential is reducing the ability. Yeah, you're right, before I'm totally dead. My growth potential was badly compromised. So what you do is that if you do what Mr. Cameron is doing, or what the Republicans in the US want to do, you reduce the growth potential, and reducing your growth potential is reducing your ability to solve the budgetary problem in the future. Because if you grow less, you will be less able to, you will raise less tax revenue in the future. And therefore, it will be more problematic to pay your tax, to have a balanced budget in the future. So you see, that's a very stupid thing to do, to solve budgetary problem by sacrificing education, health, support to small and medium-sized firms, support to innovative investment. It's shooting you in the feet. That's not the way to go. There are other things you can save money on, but not those things, okay? Second idea, investment should go along with changing governance, like in universities. Industrial can work if properly governed, okay? That's what I want you to take out of this first part. Now I go to the insurer, state as an insurer. So here I look at labor markets. Of course, I will show a few pictures, and I'm sure Tito will say, my God, this is really total garbage that he's showing, because Tito is a serious labor economist, and, you know, I'm an amateur here. Okay, so I constructed, with the help of a friend at OECD, an index of what I call flex security. You know what flex security is? The idea is the following. You know that an innovation economy has a lot of job creation, job destructions. So what you want to do is first to give wage insurance to those who are unemployed. But you tell them, look, I give them this insurance not for free, not for you to go to the Luna Park and have fun. No, for you to get training and to get training for a new job. So we constructed an index called Flex Security that combines the fact that you give a generous compensation with the provision of training, you see, to those who are unemployed. We call that Flex Security. And we looked at the relationship between unemployment and flex security, and the relationship is negative. You see, those who do more flex security, they have less unemployment. In particular, for those who are between 15 and 24, okay, that's what you have here. And that's the difference. This is the difference of unemployment. When you have more flex security, you have less inequality between the senior and the more, and the younger people in terms of unemployment. Here, it's an interesting one. When you have more flex security, a bigger fraction of population think that they have a safe employment. That's interesting, huh? So you have flexibility, and people feel safer on the job. And here, you tell, look, you have a bigger flex security index. Those who are happy on their job are happier. Why? Are more numerous. Why? Because when you have more flex security, people take risk. And when they are not happy on the job, when they are not happy on the job, they look for another job. You see what I mean? Because they know that they have support to retrain into another job. You see? So they end up in a job where they're happy. So more flex security, people are happier on the job. Because if they are not happy, they retrain with support of the state to go on the job that they prefer. So you get less unemployed and happier people at work when you have more flex security. That's the idea. But you don't want to create assisté. You want to help people take risk, look for new jobs, be mobile, it's like skiing. If I don't teach you skiing, you will not go on the black slope, okay? But if I teach you skiing, then you will go on the black slope. It's the same with flexi security. The state is there as the ski monitor, as the ski teacher. You see, to tell you that, you don't die if you go on the black slope. But I need to teach you the technique and to support you with a safety net, okay? That's the new role of the state. Second thing is the macroeconomic risk. The macroeconomic risk, in fact, you see, there was a big debate with what to do when you have a recession. So there was the recession. You might have seen the debate in Italy, I don't know. You had on the one side what we call the Keynesians. The Keynesians say, well, whenever you have a recession, you should foster the economic machine by giving salaries everywhere so that demand goes up. It's very much a demand-led view, okay? It doesn't matter, give money, employ people, to clean up a clean place already. You give him a wage, he will spend the wage, that will make the economy go up. That's called the Keynesian multiplier, okay? So that's one view. Another view is the conservative. So the Keynesian view says, increase public spending no matter where, it will make the economy restart. The conservative view is that you should cut tax, that the firms are what important, so cut their tax and cut public spending to lower interest rates. And the combination of the lower tax and low interest rates, firms will find it good to invest, and that's what will restart the economy. That's Mr. Cameron. The Keynesian view is a bit, I would say, Krugman nowadays. Some people who are kind of, old Keynesian fashion, okay? I'm neither of the two. I'm a bit closer to Keynesian, though, but I'm neither of the two. I am Schumpeterian, okay? So what does it mean? So what does it mean that I am Schumpeterian? It means the following. What's the problem with the Keynesian policy? Why the Keynesian policy is a problem nowadays? Because you have open economies. If you decide to boost demand in Italy by giving wages, what will the Italians do? They will buy German products. Okay? So it will benefit Germany, not Italy. So in the open economy of nowadays, in the globalized economy, Keynesian multiplier doesn't work well. Why can't you be for Mr. Cameron? Because if you just do laissez-faire and cut spending and don't do anything, firms in recessions, they need to invest in R&D and in growth-enhancing investment. If you don't help them do that, those who are credit constrained, and I go back to my credit constraints, they die. Do you see what I mean? They cannot maintain their R&D and other innovative investment. So the state cannot just step out. The state needs to be there to maintain those investments, the innovative investment, R&D, training investment, IT equipment over the business cycle. That's very important because otherwise firms don't survive. And if the credit market was perfect, there would be no problem for them. They would always borrow up to the net present value of their profits. But the credit market is not perfect. They can only borrow a multiple of their cash flow. But cash flow in recession is low. So you cannot. So in recession, you are dead if you are very credit constrained. And that's where the state can help you and do what the market doesn't do. You see, that's what Mr. Cameron doesn't understand either. Okay? So that's the view. So in fact, you see, that's what I call the third way. I propose that you have what I call counter-cyclical fiscal and monetary policy. What does it mean, counter-cyclical fiscal policy? I do more deficit in recession, but I reduce my deficit in booms, okay? What is it, counter-cyclical monetary? I reduce the interest rate, the short-term interest rate in recession, I increase them in boom. Those policies are very good because they help firms maintain a growth-enhancing investment over the business cycle, and therefore it makes the economy grow faster. So, so that's you see, that's what I say to you. More counter-cyclical policies that increase public deficit in recession, reduce them in booms, are more growth-enhancing in countries or sectors that are more credit constraints. Okay? So here we are distinct for the Keynesian. We are not looking at demand effect. We look at long-run growth effects working through the supply side of the economy, through firms, whereas the adept of the Keynesian multiplier emphasize short-term demand effects. So we are different from the Keynesians. And we are also different from Cameron, who says we should do nothing. Okay, so, by the way, the counter-cyclical policy, let's look who is counter-cyclical or not. You will not be very happy with this one. Who is very pro-cyclical? Italy and Greece. And France is not very good, you can see. We are not far from. But those who are very counter-cyclical are the Scandinavians. So if we become, the French and the Italian, more Scandinavians on counter-cyclical policy, we will grow faster. That's what we should be doing. Reduce our deficits. Now the question is, why are some countries pro-cyclical? Because in France and in Italy, when the governments have surpluses, the voters want to get those surplus, otherwise they don't re-elect the government. Because they think they are corrupt and they will put the money in their pocket. They don't believe in rainy day funds. If the Italian government says, look, I create a rainy day fund for the good days, well, come on, you will put it in your pocket. I don't believe it. In France, we had that problem too. Whereas in Scandinavia, you trust that the government is not corrupt. And therefore, you are more counter-cyclical. You see, so that's a very deep thing to work on. Okay, so now I want to finish up with the state as a guarantor of the social contract. There is a very interesting thing, is that we know that to become more innovative, we need flexibility in the system. We need more flexible labor markets. We need more flexible product markets. Even though I am for industrial policy, I believe in competition and entry. I think that's the name of the game, but complemented by industrial policy. Those are important. But on the other hand, you see people may not like it. You see what's very interesting here is that the two ideas I want to push that the government should invest in trust to foster liberalization and consolidate structural reforms. And Mario Monti, a few years ago, would go around and say something very good. And I don't know if he's here, but he stopped it. He was going around Europe, and he was saying, look, you want to liberalize the product market, but you need fiscal reforms and fiscal coordination to do it. Then he stops doing it. I say, why did you stop? He said, because the German didn't like what I say. But so what? Why should you stop? Because you German don't like what you said. Keep saying it. It's very good what you said. So I still, since Mario is not pushing his own point, let me do it for him, okay? So here I'm showing a picture that shows the link between trust and regulation of entry. Regulation of entry is how difficult it is to create a new firm. And trust is how you ask people questions. Do you trust your neighbor? Do you trust your employer? Do you trust the government? And all the questions, those answers are correlated. But you can see that countries with high trust or low distrust, like Sweden, the Scandinavian, have low regulation of entry. Countries with low trust have high regulation of entry. It's not by pure chance. Because when you don't trust, you want the state to step in and regulate everything. But when the state regulates everything, you don't invest in trust. If I know that the state regulates our relation, I don't need to invest in trust with you. The state is telling us what to do. So there is a vicious circle of countries that have low trust, therefore they ask for regulation, and therefore they keep having low trust. You see what I mean? So that's a vicious circle. So you need to do liberalization. It's not just to say, I have a decree saying liberalization. You need to invest in trust in society. That's why you need the state also as what I call a social contractor, you see, to invest in trust. That's true for regulation of entry. It's true for rigidity of employment. Countries that have low distrust or higher trust have less rigidity of employment. It's easier to have rules where you can fire and hire freely because you know that firms are not abusing this right. You know they are not screwing you up. Whereas in countries where you know they screw you up, you want very rigid labor market rules because you don't trust your employers. You see the problem? So what is the lesson from this? The lesson from this is that regulation of product labor market appears not to be negatively correlated with trust. It doesn't mean that you should just liberalize and then trust comes. No. It means that the state needs to invest in social capital at the same time that it invests in liberalizing markets. What does it mean, social capital? Is anything that makes us trust more than that. I will not transform into a priest. Let's love each other. Let's trust each other. But you know, that's how you do that. Well, first you reduce corruption. Free press. So here again, France and Italy are not well. You see, we have the same low Korea. South Korea is worse than we are. It's good that they have them. It's good they exist, the South Koreans. Yeah. But you see, in general, countries that have freer press, they have less corruption. Okay? In France, we have problems with free press. The problem we have is that we have a president of the republic who is paranoiac, you know, when he sees an article against him. So he wants all big newspapers to be owned by people, by conglomerates who get public contracts. That's what he does. And last year, for example, when Le Monde was supposed to be, Le Monde is a French newspaper sold, I headed a campaign of economists, of 26 signatures of economists, to prevent Sarkozy, who brought the director of Le Monde to his office at the Élysée and said, look, you have bid A and bid B. I want you to take bid A. If you don't take bid A, I stop subsidizing printing of Le Monde. But those kind of things are not good. You see what I mean? So that's why France is doing so poorly. And France should move towards, again, always, you know, the Northern Europe. Yeah? And so that's I think, is important. Reducing corruption is good for growth. You see, on the horizontal axis, I have corruption, controlling corruption, and growth on the vertical. Those who control corruption grow faster, okay? And now there is another thing which is good when you reduce corruption, is that people are more willing to pay taxes. Why? Because they know that the tax revenues will be used better by the government. So, for example, here is the relationship between tax and growth in high corruption country. When you tax more in high corruption country, people invest less because they don't trust that, you know, what will be done with the tax. Whereas if you are in low corruption countries and you tax a bit more, you don't reduce growth because people say, no, they will invest in infrastructure that will complement my own investment. So let me invest more myself. You see? So corruption is very important because reducing it allows you to play more on the tax pillar, you see, which is so important to have investing in growth while maintaining budgetary equilibrium, budget balance. So that's a very important thing, the corruption. Not only reducing corruption, you know, makes society more unified because you don't have special interest, but it also improves, you know, the efficiency of your tax system and what you can do with it, okay? So that's very important. The one thing I want to talk also is tax monitoring and tax ethics. For example, in Greece, nobody pays taxes. How can you turn Greece into Sweden? I don't know if that will ever happen in my lifetime, but you know, it might. And so the thing you can do is tax monitoring is good. When you do tax monitoring, why do people pay more tax? First, because I say if I don't pay tax, I will be punished. But there is another reason. I know now that you will be monitored, so I anticipate that you will be paying tax. In fact, there are a lot of studies that show that when I know that you pay tax, I'm more willing to pay tax. I don't want to pay tax if I think you don't. Okay? So there is, and of course I pay more tax if I know that there is a better use of public funds. So there is a virtuous circle of tax monitoring and on tax ethics. So conclusions, the state has 3 roles to play: investor, regulator, guarantor of the social contract. Conclusion 1, the state as an investor, the need for fiscal consolidation should not lead to give up on investment in health, education, support to SMEs. Mr. Cameron is wrong. Second, investment should go along with changes in governance, like for universities. 3, industrial policy can be rehabilitated if it's properly governed and made competition friendly. Second, state as an insurer. First idea, which is not here, it's on labor market, the state should provide insurance, but to help people train and rebound, not to have people become lazy and idle. So that's the new way of insuring. You see what I mean? I don't insure you for you just to stay at home. I insure you for you to be dynamic and to be a risk taker. That's the first idea, which is not on the slide. Second idea, a macroeconomic policy which is neither Keynesian nor Tea Party nor Cameron, if you want. The government should pursue actively counter-cyclical fiscal and monetary policy, and its intervention should be targeted. Target small and medium-sized firms, higher education, support to employment, and labor allocation. Make sure those remain constant over the business cycle. That's what's important. You see, that's, whereas the Keynesian, they don't target. Here you target your intervention. That's very important. That's why also it's important to reduce corruption. Because when I target intervention, special interest group may come, say, target me, don't target my neighbor. That's why it's so important to fight corruption. Because if I want to have a targeted policy, the targeted policy turns into corruption and clientelism if you don't have the free press and if you don't have all the safeguards to make sure that I'm not corrupt. You see what I mean? That's why democracy becomes very important in this view of the state. And finally, so that brings me to the last one. You need the state as a guarantor of the social contract. You need to deepen democracy, media independence, independent evaluation of public policy to reduce corruption. You need tax monitoring to reduce tax ethics. You need the state as an investor in trust to foster and consolidate structural reforms. And I think this is a new view of the state, is what I call the social democracy of innovation. That's something that exists in some countries, but in few of them, that each country has to find a way to do it for its own. But I think that's a fantastic project, and I hope that I recruited you to it. Thank you very much.
Grazie mille professore. Faremo un sondaggio alla fine per...
Thank you very much, Professor Guillon. Might be interesting to make an opinion poll to see how many believe that Greece can become Sweden. I wonder whether some people have questions. Yes? I know you have one microphone available, so we could start from these 2 gentlemen who asked for the microphone.
First of all, congratulations on your talk. You convinced me. I think I'll read your next book. I would like to ask you, I'm probably a bit biased because we build scenarios, but as you mentioned, innovation in the social side. Have you ever applied your theories to the scenario building methodology? Have you ever tried the scenario building methodology to see what is going to happen in the future? Well, you were talking about innovation in the social context. So looking at your data, a lot of time we use statistical data and we match them with the scenario methodology. Have you ever thought about
yes,
that?
we try a bit to look, or I looked a bit at scenarios where we look at what Germany will do. You see, because a lot will depend in Europe on Germany. Will Germany do this? Will Germany do that? And then I look at various scenarios, also regarding the effect of the crisis. Is the crisis having an effect like this? Is it a durable effect on growth? Is it just a trou d'air, as we call, like a turbulence, and you go like this? So there I applied scenarios, and depending on those, but what I try to do is to say you can impact on the scenario. You see what I mean? The view of endogenous growth, which I push, is that there is no fatality. What you do influences the course of history, and you are your own, you are your own actor of your own life. You see what I mean? You influence. So it's not just that, of course you could say things would be different if the dollar devaluates more, if the dollar devaluates less, the budgetary constraints should be tighter or less tight. But still, in all scenarios, I think you would try to push as much as you can, investing in innovation the way I suggested.
Can I ask a question here as
Yeah.
well? We talked, you started a conversation, very compelling conversation
Yeah.
on innovation, that the
Yeah.
countries now need to move towards innovation
Yeah.
away from imitation. And you seem to, throughout the conversations, disassociate all the elements that would lead to innovation. But in none of the charts have you actually shown how innovative each of the country is versus the indicator you're discussing. For example, we don't have a chart that looks at innovation versus corruption, innovation versus
but I didn't have
decentralization,
time.
innovation versus...
So I have that in the book. I have that. It's true, I should say I should try and do my book, but I can't send the book to everybody yet because my publisher will get very angry at me. We did that. So we look at corruption and innovation. It's because innovation and growth will go very much the same way. So I showed some pictures with growth. They are very similar if you look at patents, for example. If you look at various index of innovation, you get very similar correlations.
But I think you've pointed out Sweden and some of the Nordic countries many times because they're such good performers.
Yeah.
But you might find that they're not such great innovators.
In fact, they used not to be, and since the 90s, they've become much better, actually. Partly because they did a fiscal reform. So we can talk about the fiscal reform they did. They managed to get now a fiscal system which has three nice properties. It has a good return of the tax revenue, so they can finance targeted investment. It's very egalitarian, very highly progressive, but at the same time it doesn't discourage innovation. So they lower the capital, for example, capital income tax to 30%. They have a dual system, which does very well at doing those three things. And, but that, I think, was key in getting them suddenly to patent much more. That I have in the book, but I don't have time to speak here. Can talk more. No.
Mi sembra che c'era un'altra domanda davanti. Sì.
Yeah.
It seems there's another question.
Trust is like the thing which makes work the state. So my question is it like going back to our basic human relationship? Because it is trust. Like if I trust you, you're like my brother. Is it true?
No, but the idea is that, you see, you can make some investments that improves trust. You see, because if you say it's trust, people say, well, then it's fatality. We are finished, because we don't trust each other. Let's forget about the whole thing. And what's interesting is that you have certain kind of reforms or investment that, for example, preschooling. We know that you invest a lot in preschool, and you have kind of horizontal way of teaching in preschool, so people collaborate. We've seen that it has big effects on how people trust each other and relate to each other when they are in the same firm later on. So that's very interesting, though. That's, for example, that one example. But you can do various, or for example, another reform you can do. I can decide that if you, the unions, the employee and employer union, you make an agreement, I put money into the thing. I invest in it. Well, that induces a lot of trust building. So you see, you can do, policy can foster trust. You see, trust is not a fatality thing. It's something that you can act upon.
Okay, thank you. And so how do you see Italy?
Full of promise.
Yes, of course.
Altre domande? Dopo questo-
Well, I was very interested by the attention to the Keynesian multiplier, which is decreasing in a globalized economy.
Yeah.
But then your argument that if I am paid, I will spend my money in Germany, tends to let me think, okay, let's take a Keynesian economy and protectionism. But then I studied economics and I was said that protectionism is a blasphemy. So,
no, you don't want protectionism. What you have to do is that if you say just I subsidize consumption everywhere, you see, so you should focus on investment. What would be very important is that you make sure you have the business cycle, that firms' growth-enhancing investment, which is training, R&D, lab equipment, those are maintained over the cycle. That's what's important. We have the automatic stabilizers already socially. You need to extend the notion of automatic stabilizers to those growth-enhancing things. That's the policy that I'm recommending. This is neither Keynesian, because it's not pure demand-driven, it's supply-driven and targeted to those investments, but it's not, nor is it a Cameron who says just I knew nothing and I let firms die. You see what I mean? And so that's what I'm recommending, to extend the notion of automatic stabilizer to growth-enhancing investments.
Altre domande? Signor?
What do you think of some recent research that are telling us that we need a zero growth?
Why the environmental economists?
No, generally, economists.
Why you would need zero growth? No, because usually people act on, some people say growth can have bad, because it's true, growth has bad effects. We saw that growth, to the extent it's related to innovation, means creation and destruction of jobs. That can be very bad. Okay? The second thing is that we know that growth can create bad environmental consequences. Okay? So we know that growth creates stress, can create a bad environment. So some people say, let's just not have growth. But you know, that's not really an option, because first we know if you want to afford a health system, which becomes more and more costly, you need to grow. Otherwise, you can't finance them. You see what I mean? We live much less well if we don't have growth. Half a point of growth more. There are so many things which are nice and you can do. Much more comfort you can have. So the idea of no growth, when you look at it, you say what no growth would mean. North Korea is not growing, but you know, you cut electricity, all the time. You know, if you start living half a day in a zero growth economy, people would think twice before they say that. But what they are right is that growth has some bad aspects. You need to deal with them. That's why you need the state as an insurer. You see what I mean? So it's not because you can't insure that you say stop the whole thing. No, keep the whole thing, but with the proper insurance.
Signore? No.
Volevo chiederle, negli ultimi...
I have a question. In the past few years in Italy, the role of major, large companies has been reduced. In the past years in Italy, the role of large enterprises has been reduced significantly. So we have a lower number and a lesser role of large enterprises. Do you believe that in Italy, in the future, we might do without such an important company as Fiat, which in the past was a key for our industrial system? Or do you think that we are simply getting weaker and weaker and there's no real solution? And I also have another question, if I may. Do you believe that there are some key strategic sectors for a country like Italy that have to be protected to preserve the competitiveness of our industry as a whole?
Yeah, so you asked me a difficult question. I think that, it's not that you should choose a champion firm. I think, because through industrial policy was one of saying you choose a champion and you protect your champion. Alors, it's true when you have a firm like Fiat that employs a lot of people, that has a lot of externalities on the life of, of Torino and the area, and then I think you have good reasons of development, of territory development to help these firms, and also because this firm has a strategic effect. So for example, in the United States, Obama helped General Motors. You see why? Because you have a lot of human capital. You see, they have people with knowledge and learning. If the firm disappears, all this human capital is destroyed. So it's very important. That goes back to my counter-cyclical policy. It's very important to make sure that because of the recession, you won't have large firms that suddenly disappear. You see, because they cannot sustain. So the state has a role to play there, because the state takes into account the fact that it's important to maintain the human capital, the know-how of the country. That's a very important thing. That doesn't mean that you should always maintain obsolete firms. You should help them modernize. You see what I mean? So what Obama did, it's again the governance and subsidy. He said General Motors, he told them, I will help you, but you restructure and you go into clean cars, into electric cars. You see what I mean? That's what the government did. And that's the way I think industrial policy should go, is that you should do it in a way that pushes the firm to modernize, you see, to modernize, to stand the international competition. You should not just withdraw, but you should prepare the firm for the international competition. You should not protect the firm against international competition. You should prepare it to it. You see what I mean? That's the way I view things. You should help the large firm compete better tomorrow. So it should become stronger. And that's why Obama has done with General Motors. General Motors is a stronger firm now. You see? And now can compete better on the international market. You see? And I have other examples like this. So that's the industrial policy, the way I see it. Is that it's not that you ignore competition. No, you play the game of competition, but you give all the chances to your citizens, to your firms, to be strong and good in the competition. The strategic sectors, we know more or less what it is. I don't know for Italy, but I mean strategic sectors, people would say green innovations, biotech, health is a strategic typically, green energy, those are software, computers, usually the strategic are thought to be those ones. And now Italy may have other strategic sectors, and I don't know what they are for Italy, but for France, I would tell you those would be the ones I would consider. You see, biotech, energy, aircraft, transportation, and biotech and IT. I think those are things that I would push.
Maybe it was true, something about the recent debate in Italy about
Fiat?
the M&A, the takeover of Parmalat through Lactalis, where at one point people have said that Parmalat as a dairy company could be a strategic sector. And they made a reference to the French decree, I don't remember, it was De Villepin, your place stuff and so on. Maybe it was part.
So that raises, of course, an interesting question also is about foreign ownership. Do you allow foreign ownership of large firms in your country, and how to which point? And that's a difficult question. I think what matters is not so much the ownership, but it's the kind of contract you pass with the state. I can subsidize you and help you, but you need to play the game with employment and not, and I think whether or not you have foreign ownership or not, there need to be a social contract between firms and large enterprises, between the state and large enterprises. Yes. But, yeah.
L'ultimissima.
Yes.
Just one more question. What do you think is the role of key sectors like the steel sector or the petrochemical sectors that provide competitiveness downstream? What's your opinion about the role of these companies, these sectors in Italy?
The question is delicate because you want environment at the same time. You want to push environment. So maybe you have to do that progressively, but you have then the conflict between fostering industry and, on the other hand, pushing for environment. And so maybe there are ways that they could reconvert progressively into developing cleaner technologies, and you may want to accompany them in that process. You see what I mean? Like Vattenfall, for example, is a firm in Sweden that was involved in dirty technologies and then went to invest in cleaner technologies. So to the extent that you could accompany that movement, there is a way to help those firms make that transition.
I have a question about the state as investor.
Yes.
State as investor. I'm not entirely sure what you mean by that. So in the sense, do you mean there should be publicly owned firms making investments? Or do you mean that the state should tweak the tax system so the private firms make investments? And other sectors that should be run by the state, should be the health sector, so be dominated by state companies, or should be left to the private companies?
Yeah, I think nowadays there was a time where we thought that having publicly owned companies was very important. So maybe like in public utilities it's important, maybe the post, you know, and so maybe that should be. But you know, I think now we came to the view that the state can do a lot by just, you know, through subsidizing and, you know, certain kind of investment and I think that's part of the new way of doing policy. So public ownership seems to me less important than it used to be. Because before firms were not moving. Now you have new firms replacing old firms all the time. So having public ownership doesn't mean much. You see what I mean? So I think that now it's more through subsidies, but the whole thing is you want to make sure you don't pick firms the wrong winner. You see what I mean? You don't pick firms arbitrarily. And you are not subject to, you know, to private interest to pick that firm and not that firm. And that's where you need the good governance of industrial policy. To say, for example, that sector I will push, but then I push everybody in the sector, not just Mr. X and not Mr. Y. I want something which is level playing field within the sector, even though I might help such and such sector. You see, I mean, that's more my way of looking at things.
Come abbiamo molte domande, magari ne
I see that there are many questions. We could get two questions.
You think should be industrial policy in Europe? It should be done in a state level or a European level?
I would think much better at European level, because what you have certain times is that you have some sectors have what I call high fixed cost of operation. So for example, it could be that at the French level, only one firm could operate in one sector. So then it's clearly anti-competitive. If I had industrial policy done at European level, I'm more likely to have what I like, which is to subsidize several firms in the same sector. Do you see what I mean? So my preference would be as much European as you can have, but then you need a bigger EU budget. The problem is that the EU budget is way too small at the moment to have, to have on the industrial policy entirely done at EU level. So you need to rethink the EU budget and the contributions to EU budget. Ideally, it would be great, but given things what they are now, states have to be a big part of those investments because the budget at EU level is not big enough.
Allora, prendiamo due domande, dunque la sua e poi il signore...
There are two more questions.
I'm here.
Yes.
So your entire lecture, my name is Eric, I'm also an economist, and your entire lecture is about growth.
Yeah.
I have a very, very basic question. How do you define growth? And given your definition, until what point should growth continue? And is this the same in Europe, Japan, US,
yeah,
or different in developing countries?
Yeah. So, yes. Yes, okay, we take another question. Okay.
I have a very small one.
Yes.
I do buy your concept. What is your view on the implementability of your concept? I mean...
Of implementability of?
Your concept. Or the implementability of your concepts.
Oh.
Yeah, because you basically are saying it is better to invest, especially on Western economies, but to invest you need to look for a longer return. And at the moment, I think in the Western economies, there is a lack of leadership and political goodwill to make investment. So yeah, I see it difficult, unfortunately, to see them implemented.
Okay. So let me answer these two. You don't want to ask me a question? No question? Okay. So let me try to answer these two questions. On growth, what I call growth is the rate at which, for example, GDP per capita grows. I'm very much interested in standards of living. So it's GDP per capita, at which rate it grows. But another measure of growth is how innovative you are. Okay? Now you could say, do I care about growth? Then there have been studies trying to link happiness to growth. And there's been a very interesting studies by Angus Deaton, who is an economist at Princeton, and by Justin Wolfers, who show that there is a link between what we call life satisfaction, how well people think they are doing, how many prospects they think they have in life, and GDP growth. Those are related. That's very interesting, no? Economies where you have growth are economies where people think they have prospects for progress. And that, I think, is an important degree. So that's why growth is important, in addition to the fact that growth, as I said, helps you finance your health system and various things. Of course, we don't grow at 10% like China, because China is catching up. When you catch up, you make big, each time you innovate, you catch up by a lot. So a catching up country always grows faster than a country which is at the frontier of the technology. You see what I mean? But at least we could grow as fast as the US. And Europe was growing much slower than the US since the mid-90s. And the question was what? It's because the institutional change I talked about, universities, more flexible labor and product market, those guys you had in the US, you didn't have in Western Europe. That's why we were growing at a slow rate. So the view is to say you need those things in Europe, in Italy, in France, to grow faster. But I told you that to get there, you need the social contract, you need the state as a catalyzer, you need the state to put oil in the machine to have this liberalization machine work and produce the higher growth that you want. And so that's about the growth, you see. That's why growth is important. The implementability, you said, well, it's true in Europe. Now we have, it's true in Europe is not a fantastic thing because we have the budgetary problem. We have to solve. So the state, there are little things that the state can do. That's why it's important that the state be selective and that the state govern well its spending because the state has the budgetary problem. And it's important to have the fiscal reform because Italy and France could have a much more efficient fiscal system to finance better the investment in growth that we need to make. Because we have to rely on ourselves. On who else will we rely? The Chinese are very active. Shall we let the Chinese overtake the whole world? I mean, we need to do that ourselves. And I think we need to reform ourselves. And if we reform ourselves with a good fiscal system, with a good targeting of investment and a good governance of our investment, we can already generate much more growth. And that's the only way. There is no other way. I mean, you see, there is no escape to having better educated workforce, good health, good small and medium-sized enterprises, a smart industrial policy. There is no alternative to that. You can't escape this. You have to go through this.
Allora, signor in blue, Eric, poi.
Good afternoon.
I think
you say that Keynes doesn't seem to work.
Yeah.
And you're an Harvard professor. Because Keynes basically pays people to do useless job, like dig a hole and put the money down on it.
I was being a bit caricatural.
Exactly. And,
of course.
When I look at how the US, and you teach in Harvard, which to me is in US, but when I look how the US solved approached the crisis, basically they took a very Keynesian approach. They just prefer to dig the holes close to Wall Street. So basically, coming to financial innovation and counter-cyclicality, basically, I think that one approach, one tentative, I'm not sure how successful, that Europe is doing in that you as a French should know it, is Basel III counter-cyclical approach in banking.
Same thing. It's the same argument.
Exactly. But
that's why I gave the argument for the Basel III.
Exactly. But United States is not adopting Basel III. Like it's not the United States.
Who is not adopting it?
United States.
Yeah, they are wrong.
It is not, like they did not adopt. So basically, I wonder if someone is coming to your seminars in Harvard.
That would be great. Yeah, they are wrong. Obama didn't come. It's a pity he didn't make it. He should have. No, you're absolutely right. I gave the argument for Basel III. The same argument I gave is also an argument that of course, you need banks to capitalize very much, but be less demanding on their capitalization in recession than you are in expansion. The same argument as Basel III, which is a cyclical capitalization requirement, is exactly the corollary of what we discussed there. And on the Keynesian, I mean, there was the debate. I think the Republicans look crazy in the US, but they are not totally wrong. They said you invest everywhere. They should have. It's true one thing, for example, that Obama didn't do. I was talking to Alan Kruger, who left now. I say, why didn't you do like Germany, target labor market policies? That would have been smart. Instead of saying you put money in NSF in here and there, why don't you target labor market policies? That would have been much more efficient, and you would not have lost so badly the elections as you did in November. That would have been much smarter. And Obama, if he loses the election next year, I hope he won't, it would be because unemployment rate would not have gone down by enough. He should have targeted. That's what they didn't do. They went everywhere with the Keynesian view, the multiplier, which is wrong, the way they look at it, instead of saying, let's target on supply side economy, labor market, pro-innovation. That's what will get us out.
Altra domanda?
I think they are dead. I think I killed them completely.
I see some alive in the first row.
Just a quick question. Next week we have a referendum here on whether to keep water companies in the public sector or to privatize them. What would you vote for?
Oh, God. Well, I would trust my friends, but then if I express bias, you will not. Yeah, I think usually public utilities, I tend to be more in favor of keeping them in the public sector, usually. I mean, but you know, I know those are being debated. My own bias is that public utilities, I would not be the first thing I would privatize. At least I would make sure that, you know, they fulfill the role of providing. So, for example, if you privatize trains, you know, all the externalities of having low tarification and good quality of transportation is not internalized. For example, there was an interesting article in Economics on privatizing prisons. So let me tell you about the story. So it's colleagues of mine. One is called Oliver Hart, and another colleague called Schleifer and Vishny. And they say, why should you privatize prisons? You know, you have many prisons that are privatized in the US. Now, prisons can do two things. They can reduce their costs, but they can also train the prisoners to become good citizens. The problem is that is not verifiable. So when you privatize a prison, what do you think the prison does? It becomes more cost effective. So the food is awful and everything. So they eat shit, essentially, okay? They become less costly, but they don't, but you rarely see people coming out of private American prisons become a good citizen afterwards, because all that work is not done, okay? That's the problem of privatization. If there is a kind of a service that you are providing, not just the cost reduction, which has a quality which is not fully marketable, like having a prisoner being rehabilitated, there is not a market for that. Then you think twice before you privatize. Now I don't know how the water example, how close it is to the prisons. I respond to an answer by an answer. That's the way we learn.
Altre domande?
Both with reference to enhancing trust and innovation, what's your evaluation of cultural policies? And I ask you this question because both in France and in Italy, I have the feeling that cultural policy is very conservative, focused on conservation of heritage, while all this creative industry literature is disregarded, whereas in places like Scandinavia, it's a big issue. So
what do you mean by culture? So the culture of...
Oh, well, it's this new idea that by using public money to foster new innovation in things like design and things like that, and media, cinema, etc.
Oh yeah, media, cinema, things, and protecting cinema. I think that's important. It keeps cohesion of a society, I think. So for example, France subsidized its movie industry a lot, France. And France was badly criticized for that. But I think it was a very good move to do it. I think they were right to do it. I think it was great when you had Cinecittà. No, maybe I'm a kind of nostalgic of Cinecittà, but I don't know if you... but I think it's a good thing to do that. I think it helps keep a society cohesive. I think it's important. It's part of the social contract, I think.
Altre domande? Magari io avrei una domanda, la faccio in inglese. Do you think because you mentioned several times that if states should save money, they should not save money on health, instruction and so on. But are you happy with the mechanism right now at the European level, all these constraints on fiscal policy? And because
no, I'm not.
Something like if I'm not wrong, in the Sapir report, something like 8 years ago, it was already a big debate about the Stability and Growth Pact.
Yeah.
And now we are really even more severe with these targets. And is it possible to reallocate money from one part to the other, or should we change that?
Yeah, so in the Sapir report already we were saying that we were for rainy day funds, so we were to push, and you know rainy day funds with European stamp, it's easier to have the rainy day fund. So we were in favor of having European institution that would favor the rainy day fund, where you put money aside in a credible way. I told you before that the problem when you have a surplus is that the people in your country doesn't trust you. But you could put that in a European fund, then people know that the money will be used for yourself. So Europe can help in having the rainy day funds, and I think that would be a good policy. More generally, the Social Stability Pact should be a pact which is counter-cyclical, that fosters counter-cyclicality. So fiscal discipline is something that helps, but also being more exigent when things go well with countries. That's important. Don't wait that things go bad. You know, we should have looked into Greece and Portugal when things were going apparently well, not wait. You know, you cannot be no police when things go well and then use nuclear force and do Hiroshima when things go wrong. You should always have the monitoring at all times, you see, when things go well in particular. That's part of the counter-cyclical policy, which I'm calling for.
Thank you. Maybe a last question. Ultima domanda. Allora, vi ringrazio molto di essere...
Well, no questions. So thank you very much for coming. You might have been, appealed to learn French and not to wait till September when the translation of the book will be available, so that we'll have the opportunity to speak of that again here in Trento or elsewhere in Italy. Thank you very much.